Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us across the fence. I'm Fran Stoddard. I am honored to welcome back Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at UVM, Dr. Wanda Grant. In her 3 decades working for the university and raising a family in Vermont, she has been a catalyst for change as much as a witness to it. As her job entails helping the entire student body, faculty, and staff at UVM navigate difficult issues, we've invited her to talk about what's happening now and how best to move forward in these ever-changing times. So, hello, and thank you for joining us. So, Wanda, what would you say is the role of UVM in helping us better understand systemic racism and in moving the social justice needle forward?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I think it's the same answer for all institutions of higher education. But I believe that we have an obligation to disseminate and engage with knowledge. To cultivate critical thinkers and doers. Through speakers and courses and programs, and I feel like we are bound together by individual stories and our collective stories, and whether they're down on paper or whether we're speaking them with our voice, that it is important that we share that information and hope that we are cultivating and nurturing something and fostering something around openness and justice and respect, as well as really getting at some of those more complex and difficult issues around inequalities and social justice.
Yeah, and it certainly seems that the university is very dedicated, much due to you and your work in this direction.
Well, I definitely, I feel proud of what I've done, but I certainly want to be able to really clearly say that, I don't do this by myself. And there's a great team of people that I work with that are in front of me, beside me, behind me, all of those kinds of things. And it's a good time. I really like to give a shout out to the D&I division, the identity centers, and the other folks that really work hard. And you know what? Leadership around this is so important. So, I can't do that without the president, the provost, and the rest of my colleagues. I really appreciate them.
So how has COVID changed your work, diversity work?
Yeah, well, COVID has really made me think about, what's the roadmap in terms of doing DE&I work remotely. And so very early on, I put together some thoughts for myself and the university leadership about things that we should do do, especially basically taking inclusive excellence virtually. And so we're putting on many of the same programs that we would have done face to face, and we're just being very creative about it. But what it certainly has exposed is, access to technology. It has exposed, what are some of the disparities that exist for vulnerable populations, underrepresented populations, and what we need to do. And so I think that it is put front and center, not only healthcare issues, but other access and equitable issues that we're seeing, not just here in Vermont, because we are not in a bubble, but that we're seeing across the world, and especially in the other 49 states.
Sure. Hey, can you talk just a little, this is a huge topic, but how power privilege shows up in Vermont?
Yeah, when I was thinking about that the other day, and it shows up in many ways in terms of who gets identified as Vermonters. I was thinking about, even the situation with the mural downtown, in terms of who gets seen. Vermonters, I live here. I've lived here for over 30 something years. My 3 children were born here. They are Vermonters. And so I think the narrative about who's a Vermonter, it shows up, and how it's articulated is one way. I also think that sometimes in our desire to do good around DE&I, we can also, in the end, be very exclusive in terms of putting different people in a box. So I think that I find that it's very much related to really understanding, that I am too a Vermonter, as opposed to spending a lot more energy to define who's not a Vermonter.
Right. Okay, thank you. Now, the protests in Burlington concerning police violence and brutality were somewhat controversial. And given what you've learned over time in your deep experience of Vermont and the University of Vermont, what protests and or other actions do you consider are most productive paths to systemic change, to dismantling racism?
Well, Fran, I think context matter, and I think time matters, and so forth. And so I think that protest comes in many forms, from writing letters to boycotting to doing rallies and all those kinds of things. And I think that our history has shown us that protest can and does work, different forms, different times, and all those kinds of things. And so. No one ever said, maybe they did, but I don't believe that in terms of protest does not have to be slow and protest does not have to be quiet. I think that what makes us nervous is that when it is not as quiet, or it seems to be moving fast, we have not done the work that we needed to do to prepare ourselves. And so it feels like a rush. It feels like it's, and sometimes maybe it is not as fully thought out, but I do think that it has its place, and I think it's understanding when and how to use it. And so what I think works, I think that, lifting your voices, not just to be screaming and shouting, but so that you can be heard, and so that others could be lifted up and be heard. And so I think that, again, protest comes in many different forms, shapes, and sizes. And I think that our history has shown us that it does work in many different forms. And I think that, it is a time that we need to think about how we not get to the place, if we are worried or concerned that people are lifting their voices. We need to do better.
Yeah. So is the work of diversity and inclusion different in Vermont than other places? I mean, you have a sense of the whole of what's happening nationally as well. Is it different here?
Yeah, you know what? I think that again, context can matter, geographical location can matter, but at the same time, those big issues in terms of access, opportunity, those things in terms of social justice and equity, I feel like it's across, the world, and I don't think that we're any different. But in terms of those issues and situations occurring, that folks not being able to celebrate, and the religion that they prescribe to. I think that sexual assault and harassment, I think things like gender equity and those things, they are problematic, and we need to kind of focus our attention on all of these things. What I think is slightly somewhat different when I say context and all those things matter, I do think that we are, or at least I believe at the University of Vermont, but I know in other areas of Vermont, we are in a very engaged place around this topic. And we are very active around it. And so I have an appreciation when I go other places for what we're talking about and what we're doing in the state, but especially at the University of Vermont.
Yeah. Well, your division is a very large umbrella, and not only supporting efforts around racial equality, but also equity issues of religion and gender, as you were saying. And so what are some of the key ways that UVM is continuing to grow around diversity?
Yeah, so I think the way we are growing around diversity is, our leadership, our president has, with support of the other team, looking at scholarship. There's a presidential Our Common Ground scholarship. We're looking at things in regards to building on the provost side around programs and projects that bring in folks, especially around, as I like to say, Black and brown folks, in terms of faculty and professional development, looking at how we make sure that our communities, our LGBTQ communities, are having a welcoming and safe place. We just, the provost just approved that the PRISM Center, which is our LGBTQ center, now has a home, a space and central part of the campus. Our Interfaith Center is not that building and location is not that old. We repurposed a building, and students are using it in a way that I'm so excited. I'll tell you one really quick story.
Mm-hmm.
In the Interfaith Center, I was told that there was a student from Nigeria who was looking on the website and trying to decide, what school to come to. And she chose the University of Vermont because she saw an ablution station at the Interfaith Center. And she thought, oh, there's some care there for
Yeah.
Muslims, and that
Yeah.
they're welcome. So those kinds of things are important.
Fantastic. Yeah, all the centers, your 5 centers, are very impressive, and I'm sure make a huge difference for your faculty and students.
Oh, recruitment and retention. It's such an important piece.
Yeah.
And yes, and I probably should mention, when you said what we President's Commission on Inclusive Excellence. I mean, to have a council that's focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion, that helps to advise us and support us, is very important.
Any quick best ways to move forward to make Vermont feel safe for everyone?
Yeah. I think that we must continue with the education. Awareness and knowledge, as we say, is power, and it's important. We must have accountability. When things happen, we must stop it. We can't chip away at it. We must make it crumble in terms of oppression and as well as violence and abuse and all those kinds of things. So I believe accountability, education in terms of awareness, and I do think that we all must be collectively not be silent bystanders. We
Yeah.
must
Be there.
empower each other and be there. Yeah.
Dr. Wanda Grant, thank you for your exemplary work, grace, and wisdom, and for joining us today. I'd like to drive people to your wonderful website, uvm.edu/diversity. Dr. Wanda Grant, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Fran.
And thank you for joining us across the fence. I'm Fran Stoddard. Stay well. Audio back with Wanda. Wanda, hey, that was great. You were very warmed up for that one. That was great for both of them.
Well, it's